So, is this on? Can you hear me? Am I loud enough? Wonderful. Okay, let me start out by acknowledging my collaborators. A lot of the work I'm talking about today was done in collaboration with at least those 4 people and possibly others. And to put this into context, this is one of the things that has been fascinating me for the last, well, a little over 828 days. Namely the fact that the US president is making stuff up at the rate of more than 12 times a day, according to Washington Post fact checkers. And if you look at the cumulative achievement from the beginning of his presidency, you can find some distinct periods of acceleration in the production of these arguably false claims. And I think this is one of the reasons why post-truth was coined the word of the year by Oxford Dictionaries in 2016. And that's great, except the word post-truth has an implicature. It implies something that is kind of weird and that I don't agree with. Because it somehow implies that we've gone from truth to this post-truth thing. So there was some sort of a fall from grace. Everything was just fine until all of a sudden Donald Trump started lying. Well, that doesn't quite mesh with reality in a number of ways. First of all, there's data to suggest that the public, contrary to maybe what you might have heard in the media, contrary to anecdotes, the public has actually shown an increasing appreciation of science and expertise, at least in the UK, where more people now think that scientists tell the truth than they did 10 years ago, and that's an appreciable increase. And of course, there were also untruths in public life before anybody talked about post-truth. For example, remember this? Weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They didn't exist, although we were told they were there, and that was used to justify an invasion of the country. And there is now scholarly literature, including by a colleague of mine at the University of Bristol, suggesting that this creation of weapons of mass destruction was an active campaign of deception. Now that happened 16 years ago, 17 years ago, at a time when no one talked about post-truth. So my first question is, what are we post of if there's always been untruths? What's different now? Well, I think, in my opinion, the nicest treatment of this that I've seen was published by Aaron McWright and Riley Dunlap about 1.5 years ago, where they suggested that what we've seen is not a decline in honesty or increase in falsehoods necessarily, but we've seen a shift in the ontology of truth. That is, we've seen specifically a shift from strong realism to strong constructivism. And they're arguing that in the past, in the 2000s, whenever there was something false in the public sphere, it was probably the result of a systemic lie. Something was carefully curated to deceive us, like the weapons of mass destruction. They went to great lengths to convince us that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But no one in the Bush and Blair administrations questioned the existence of Iraq. They also never said, we don't know if Iraq is even a concept. They knew it was there, and they just made claims about it that then turned out to be false. Now, that was contesting the same reality, and it was in fact contesting a reality. There was an acknowledgement that somehow the weapons inspectors and the Bush administration were having competing stories about something out there that actually exists. Now, I don't think that's the case today. I think what we have instead today is what I would like to call epistemic insouciance, where if you don't like something, you just call it alternative facts. And then somehow you're done. And it doesn't matter what the reality is. This is a very nice example. You may recall this the day after Donald Trump's inauguration. His press secretary at the time, feedback. Sean Spicer said that the largest crowd ever observed Donald Trump's inauguration. Now, if you look at the photographic evidence, we have Donald Trump on the left, Barack Obama on the right. There are actually fewer people on the left than on the right. That's even if you assume lots of people in white hoods are hiding on that background there. But they would stick out against the darker bits. So that is not a way to make up the missing people. And I'll get back to that later because this photo thing turns out to be quite important. And just in case you're wondering, remember that what you're seeing and what you're reading is not what's actually happening. Donald Trump did, in fact, say that, and that, to my mind, is a classic case of this insouciance, where the photographic evidence doesn't matter. Because, yes, you can see it, but you know what? Anything you can see is not what's actually happening, according to the president. So that, I think, is a shift towards insouciance, a lack of concern with even attempting to have a coherent picture of reality. What are the consequences of that? Well, if you look at opinion polls, not much, I think, is my interpretation of this graph. More people disapprove than approve of Donald Trump. The last observation here is from about a month ago. But, there's no clear trend. It's certainly not the case that the bottom is falling out because Donald Trump tells too many furphies. So, moreover, if you look at polling data that specifically ask whether Donald Trump is honest, then among Republicans, you find that by a 3-to-1 margin, they consider Donald Trump to be honest. Democrats go the other way, dramatically so, but among Republicans, they think he's honest. This was an NBC poll in April last year, but it's no isolated result. Here we have another one 6 months later done by a university. You get precisely the same result. 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 split among Republicans saying Donald Trump is honest. So that's kind of peculiar. And it raises two questions, both of which I want to answer. First one is, do facts matter? And the second one is, if not, why not? So let's first examine the question whether facts matter in politics. And there's two studies I want to tell you about done with Brian E. Swire, former PhD student of mine, in the lead. And what we did there, the first study was during the primaries in 2016. We presented an online sample with statements made by Donald Trump on the campaign trail. They were either true or false, even number of each. And we asked people about their beliefs. So, for example, we would say Donald Trump said that vaccines cause autism. That's false, by the way. Or Donald Trump said that the US spent $2 trillion on the war in Iraq. That's true. Now, having got the initial belief rating, we then correct the false statements and affirm the true statements and ask people again to tell us whether or not they believe those particular claims, either the next day or a week later. Actually, no, in this one it was immediately or a week later. And here are the data. Ignore the graph on the left that you can barely see. Focus on the one on the right, which is where the claims were identified as coming from Donald Trump. Ignore color of the lines for now. Focus instead on the solid versus the dashed lines. Solid lines represent facts, dashed lines represent myths. What do you find? Well, what you find is that people aren't terribly certain before they get the explanation, although there is some differentiation between facts that tend to be a little higher in belief than the myths. Then we tell people what is true and what's false. Excuse me. And what we find is, gratifyingly, everybody believes the facts more, and they believe the myths a lot less. And a week later, you get this fascinating thing called forgetting, and the lines are converging again a bit because people kind of lose track of which is what. But at first glance, where's the post-truth? People are responsive. They're sensitive to corrections. And if you now turn to color, what's even more remarkable in these data is that that is universally true for both Trump supporters and opponents. The red lines are Republican supporters of Donald Trump. Yes, they believe everything more, both facts and myths, than the other two groups, but they're sensitive to the correction. The blue lines are Democrats. The purple lines are, at the time during the primaries, Republicans who didn't support Trump. And even partisanship here doesn't seem to matter that much. So where's the post-truth? Well, the post-truth is in this slide and other aspects of the data. Because what I'm showing you here are the same people telling us who they intend to vote for and how they feel about Donald Trump. And what you can see there is that the only thing that matters is what they brought to the lab to begin with. If they walked in, well, they were online, so if they clicked in as a Trump supporter, they came out as a Trump supporter. Didn't matter what we told them. Likewise, if they didn't like Donald Trump, they still didn't like him afterwards. That's all that mattered. And moreover, the degree to which people changed their belief as a function of our intervention was completely uncorrelated with their shift in voting intentions before and after. So there's a decoupling of being responsive to corrections on the one hand, but on the other hand, it doesn't matter. I still love / hate Donald Trump. Now, this question, or this study, left open a couple of questions that I want to address. The first one is about political symmetry. We only looked at Donald Trump in the first study, and so we don't know whether this is something specific to Donald Trump or Republicans or whatever. We need to sort of broaden this out and look at the other side of politics as well. So in this second study, which was very similar to the first one, we also looked at Bernie Sanders, statements by Bernie Sanders that were either true or false. And we classified people as supporters of Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders. We used a very large sample and did exactly the same thing as before, except looking at both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And this now was done after the election, at a time, after Donald Trump had become president. Here are some sample stimuli just to explain what we did with Donald Trump. One of his myths was to claim that crime is increasing. In fact, it isn't. Crime has been falling since 1995. Bernie Sanders also got things wrong. He claimed that the 2016 election had the lowest voter turnout. Well, in fact, it didn't. He was mistaken about that. So, and as you can see, we went to fairly great lengths to explain why things were true or false, and we provided sources, and we tried to be, careful and meticulous in explaining to people why things were true and false. So let's have a look. On the left, there's Donald Trump. On the right, there's Bernie Sanders. That is statements by Trump and by Sanders. Within each graph, as usual, you have the solid lines for true statements, dashed lines for facts, for false statements. And what you find is that our intervention is increasing belief in the true stuff, decreasing belief in the false stuff, precisely as we would intend. And it does this for both supporters and non-supporters of the two politicians. So, as a first approximation, if you look at Trump and what his people say, and you then look at Bernie Sanders and what his people say, you know, there's a fair degree of symmetry there at first glance. Absolutely no question. Now, on second glance, if you dig deeper, you can argue that, well, actually, among Trump supporters, the correction isn't quite as effective because their belief in false statements doesn't go down to the level of non-supporters of Donald Trump. Whereas for Bernie supporters, they move right down to where they should be together with everybody else. Maybe there's some asymmetry there, a tiny residual asymmetry. What about feelings? Well, same as before. Nothing happens. People are unaffected by our manipulation. And now you can ask one obvious, to me very obvious question about these studies. Well, hang on, we presented an equal number of true and false statements. Maybe that's perfectly acceptable. Maybe people think, oh, half the time they should lie. Yeah, sure, right? And that is not enough to push people's feelings around. Maybe what we should do is to hammer home dishonesty for both politicians by having another condition where there's 4 falsehoods and only 1 true claim. And then really, I mean, if you're still not responsive to that in terms of your feelings, well, gee, that's pretty, you know, you're pretty resilient. And what do we find in this other condition? Well, we find pretty much what we found before, except interestingly, that slight asymmetry also replicates. There's a residual persistence in false beliefs among Trump supporters that seems to be absent in Sanders supporters. What about feelings? How do they feel? Well, look at this. If you look very carefully and you do statistics on a sample of 1,500 people, then you find that there is an effect. People on both sides, Trump supporters and Bernie Sanders supporters, are slightly less impressed with their favorite politician if they have received 4 falsehoods and only 1 true statement in the experiment. That decline from about here to there is statistically significant. But it's a small effect. And at the very end, I'll revisit that small effect. So bear that in mind, that it is small, and that I will have more to say about that later. So the bottom line is, you can tell people that something is false, that a politician said. They're okay with that. They say, oh, right, okay, well, I'll stop believing that. But by and large, it has either no or only a small effect on how politicians feel about, how people feel about that politician. So why? Why do the public, why do people accept this shock and chaos misinformation that Donald Trump is pumping out? Well, key to this, I think, is the notion of authenticity. And there was a paper published last year by Hall and colleagues that I think did a really great job in underscoring the importance of authenticity. And their argument was that Trump stating falsehoods is not a bug. It is a feature. He is stating falsehoods that are extremely easily disproven. Why would anyone do that? I mean, if a politician lies about, I don't know, having an affair or having taken the bribe, you know, you can sort of understand that from a utilitarian point of view, you know, because it's kind of, well, I don't want the public to know that. But Donald Trump is lying about everything, you know. It's just ridiculous. He says, I was in the White House all weekend, when in fact he flew down to Florida to play golf, and everybody knows that. You know, it's so easy to disprove. Why lie? Well, the answer, according to Hall et al., is that the lying is a signal. It's a signal of a violation of an establishment norm. We tell our children not to lie. So if Donald Trump lies, he's saying, hey, I'm not playing the game of the establishment. Likewise with education. If he is dissing academics, universities, scientific evidence, that's a signal of opposition to a presumed establishment that relies on all those things: education, evidence, honesty, and so on. So he's signaling that he's an authentic champion of the real people. How do we know that? Well, we know that because in the laboratory, Hall et al. Were able to turn on and off endorsement of that kind of lying. Whenever people in their laboratory experiments were led to believe that a system they were observing, an election in a university in that case, in the experiment, whenever people were led to believe that there was something corrupt or illegitimate about the process, they then came to accept a candidate who lied quite openly, but was championing the people who were disadvantaged by the corrupt system. And that is why Sean Spicer making these outrageous claims about obvious crowd pictures is actually a good signal for for Trump's followers. And it's a signal that gets propagated to the people themselves. Let me tell you about a study that was done 2 days after the inauguration, when these two pictures were all over the news and the internet, and there was a huge controversy about the inauguration size. This study was done by Schaffner and Lux, and the experimental task was very simple. Click the photo that has more people in it, okay? That's all people had to do. No further comment, just click. Now, photo A is the wrong photo, right? If you want to debate this with me, you can set up an appointment later. But I'm actually not debating that. There were fewer people in photo A than B. Well, the non-voters knew that because for them, the error rate in picking the wrong picture was negligible. Ditto for Clinton voters. These are like accidents with a coffee cup or something. You know, you just click the wrong thing by mistake. But now look at Trump voters. Oh, up to 26% of Trump voters picked the wrong picture. And these are highly educated Trump voters. Trump voters with lower education were less likely to pick the wrong photo. Education amplified the willingness of Trump supporters to pick the wrong picture because expressing support for Donald Trump was more important to them than the accuracy of picking the picture. Everybody knew at the time that there was a controversy, and they recognized the picture, and they said, oh, those liberal experimenters trying to get me to pick that one? No way. Trump had a bigger audience. Now, this is very interesting because another thing that happened with the inauguration photos is that sometime later, the original purveyors of this claim expressed regret. Sean Spicer in public on TV said, well, yeah, I should have never said that. I'm kind of sorry. Basically retracting the claim that the inauguration was attended by more people. So, where does that leave supporters? What are they going to do now? Well, a student of mine and I tried to find out, and just a few weeks ago, we did exactly the same, a similar study. We presented people with a pair of pictures from the inaugurations. A relatively small sample, but still, 200 people. And we then presented expressions of regret by Sean Spicer and also by Donald Trump himself, although that was reported indirectly. So I'm no longer all that certain about how much credence to put into that expression of regret. And then at the very end, we asked the participants again for a crowd size comparison, but without the photos. Okay? So photo, then they're told, oh, by the way, Spicer expressed regret. Then we asked them a few questions about how they felt about that, and then they got another crowd judgment. That's the bottom line of the experiment. What are the data? Well, 28% of Trump voters believed Spicer's initial claim when we asked them. They didn't pick the wrong picture, but they believed Spicer's claim about the audience being the largest ever, compared to 3% of Clinton voters. About half of Trump voters thought that Spicer's initial claim was sincere. He believed that at the time. We then confronted them with a recantation, with a retraction, expression of regret. Oh, well, that was sincere too. 40% of Trump voters thought that Spicer's correction was also honest. And then we asked them, who's got the larger crowd after they've seen Spicer's retraction of his own claim? Oh, 23% of Trump voters thought that the inauguration crowds were bigger than Clinton's. So basically, what's happening? Well, I think what's happening there is, again, precisely the same as what Schafter and Lux found, except we sort of kind of waved people around, swung them around a bit, because whenever they were given the opportunity to express support for Sean Spicer or Donald Trump, they did that. Yes, he was sincere when he first said that the crowd was bigger. Yes, he was sincere when he said, oh, shucks, that was wrong. And by the way, the crowd was bigger anyway. So that is another expression of support where people are, I think, answering a very different question from what the experimenter is actually asking. And I think that sort of authenticity and need to express support, this mutual connection between Donald Trump and his base, are what explains a lot of the success with which Donald Trump is conducting his public utterances. And now I want to turn to another question that I think is equally important, at least. And that is, how do the media handle this? What's going on with the media in this? Because yes, Donald Trump is tweeting, and millions of people follow him on Twitter, but Twitter alone, 280 characters per tweet, even by Donald Trump, that alone does not set a country's discourse, especially in a country such as the United States, where for decades there has been agreement among political scientists that the media are crucial in agenda setting of public discourse. So with Donald Trump, things seem to have changed. And I want to present you with a study, a big data analysis that we just finished, where we explored one particular aspect of Donald Trump's tweets. Now, George Lakoff from Berkeley came up with this taxonomy of what Donald Trump does, based on, he's a linguist, and based on his conceptual analysis of how Donald Trump deploys Twitter. I want to focus on this diversion notion, because that's the one that I first became fascinated by, and that I published a little paragraph or two in a recent paper. So let me now tell you about this project that we just completed by first telling you about my anecdotal encounter with diversion. I don't know if you remember this, but after he was elected, before he was inaugurated, Donald Trump went wild on Twitter, unleashing this tirade against the cast of Hamilton, a Broadway play. And that was because the cast pleaded for a tolerant and diverse America after their performance in the presence of Vice President Pence. And Donald Trump didn't like that. He went wild. Now, if you look at Google Trends, this is Google Trends data, you will have no difficulty discovering on what date Donald Trump did this, because that is when the American public searched for Trump Hamilton online with great vigor, because they wanted to find out more about what's going on. Now, here's an interesting coincidence, maybe. That eruption on Twitter coincided with the day on which Donald Trump settled a lawsuit against his Trump University for $25 million, including a $1 million penalty to the state of New York. So basically, an admission of guilt, effectively. So he coughs up $25 million, pays $1 million penalty, and he goes wild against this obscure Broadway play. I wonder if there's a connection. Well, if there was one, it was good for him, because the American public, expressed in exactly the same units by Google Trends, couldn't care less about the university settlement. No one cared. It was drowned out. So is this systematic? Does Donald Trump deploy Twitter to divert? Now, to answer the question, we first have to understand what that would look like. And here's a little graph that explains what I mean. Suppose at some point in time, the media is covering something about Donald Trump that's negative. What would Donald Trump do if he didn't like what was going on in the media? Well, he'd start tweeting about something different. And if that is successful, what would happen to the media coverage? Well, they would drop that issue, right? And if you did this statistically, what this means is that the more the media covers something negative about Trump, the more he should tweet about something else. Therefore, the next day, the less the media should talk about the bad stuff for him, right? Conceptually, that's what should happen. So now, how do you operationalize this conceptual possibility? Well, you start out by getting data. In our case, we scraped all of the New York Times, all of the ABC Evening News, all of his tweets, and that was for 2 years, the first 2 years in his presidency. And having obtained all these data, we then picked what I think no one would argue is a topic that Donald Trump didn't particularly like during those 2 years, namely the Russia Muller or Muller investigation that was done in the US. Clearly, he was not a great fan of that going on. So what then would he tweet about, if not that? What would be the likely or possible choice of topics that he would then tweet about? Well, it would be topics he owns that are his, such as the economy, jobs, China, a trade war with China, North Korea, I've got a bigger button than that guy. The wall, the Mexican wall, immigration, those are his topics. So conceptually, the prediction would be New York Times, ABC News report Russia Mueller, Donald Trump starts tweeting about anything else, and then if that is successful, they drop it. Is that what is going on? Well, let's find out. Here, we have an initial analysis where all we do is to do a keyword search and then a regression between, on the one hand, the media coverage on Russia Mueller, and on the other hand, Trump's putatively distracting tweets involving those keywords I just mentioned, China, North Korea, jobs, wall, immigration, that type of thing. And what do we find? Well, the first analysis is establishing that, yes, indeed, the more the New York Times talks about Russia, the more Donald Trump tweets about something different. And that's true for Russia or Muller. ABC News headlining Russia, much bigger effect, significant. And here we go, yet again, based on ABC News coverage. So the first step in this conceptual model is successful. We can show, at least in this limited set of keywords for starters, that the coverage is affecting what Donald Trump is tweeting about. Now, is that effective? Does the distraction work? Well, that's what's shown on this graph. Well, it's not a graph, it's a table, sorry. It's fairly complicated, so let me walk you through it. On the diagonal, what we have are effectively autocorrelations. These are the regression weights between the amount of coverage in the New York Times on day 1 and then on day 2 on the same topic. Now you can see that all of these are fairly large and they're positive. That is simply inertia, and that means if Russia Muller is a big topic on a Monday, it's likely also going to be a big topic on a Tuesday. You have to account for that autocorrelation, so we put that into the regression model together with in actual fact, 100 other control variables to deal with seasonalities and all that type of stuff. So that's okay. That just means the media tends to stick to a topic. Now look at this. This is the number of times Donald Trump on the previous day tweeted a distraction and coverage by the media on the following day of Russia and so on. All of these coefficients are negative, and they're significant. That means the more Donald Trump is tweeting about China, triggered by coverage about Russia, the less the New York Times the following day will report Russia. And it's not just the media, it's also the public. Google Trends searches for Trump Russia decline on the following day if Donald Trump spends a lot of time the previous day tweeting about his own topics. So the distraction works. Well, it sort of does. It only worked for some of the keywords, but not others. And now it gets to be a little problematic, because how do we know that this isn't sort of circular? How do we know that this is robust? How can we tell that this is generalizing in various different ways? So now let me report to you the last analysis of these data. And this is where we went a little bigger. We looked at everything Donald Trump ever tweeted on Twitter, surprisingly. We looked at all pairs of words in his vocabulary, with the exclusion of Russia, Muller, and collusion, because we were not interested in how much he commented on the investigation. We were interested in whether he started tweeting about anything else in response to coverage in the media. And we then did the usual thing in text processing and text mining. We excluded stop words and had a cutoff for the vocabulary and so on. And we then examined the generalization of this between the New York Times and the ABC News. Okay, so that was the idea here. How robust is this effect, if there is one? And how general is it across those two media outlets? And does it occur for anything? Or is it really just Russia and Muller that is triggering this? Those are the questions we try to answer. And to explain the graphs that follow, let me just clarify what exactly we did. For any possible pair of words in a tweet, and there's something like 1,440 of those, we performed a regression. We looked at whether the number of tweets of that particular pair X was a function of, let's say, New York Times coverage the same day on Russia Muller, plus all these other control variables I don't have time to explain. And that coefficient, actually the t value is that coefficient, we will plot on the x-axis, okay? Just so you understand the graphs that are coming. And then we have the second regression, which is now the consequence of the tweet on the media coverage the next day. That gets another regression coefficient that we plot on the y-axis. Again, the t rather than the raw coefficient. And this allows us to then have lots of data, each of which is a single pair of words and whose location in that space tells us to what extent it was triggered by the New York Times and to what extent it in turn suppressed, maybe, coverage of Revesz and Muller. Okay? Now, you put all this together, and then we can formulate some expectations. If nothing is happening, then everything should be in the middle. That means there should be neither an effect of coverage on Donald Trump, nor should his tweets affect coverage. That means if nothing is happening, the stuff should be in the middle. And in fact, we would expect that for neutral words in the New York Times. In fact, we'd better find that, because it would be a real problem if any word in the New York Times somehow triggered Donald Trump, because surely that can't be right. So we must find stuff in the middle where there's nothing. But if there is successful diversion, then we would expect to find a cluster in the bottom right. Why? Well, because being on the right means Donald Trump is sensitive to that coverage, and being in the bottom means the New York Times is responding negatively to his previous tweets. Okay? Comfortable with that? That is what we would expect. So this is an interpretive guide of the graphs I'm about to show you. And I'm going to start out with basketball. Why basketball? Well, that's pretty neutral. So what I'm showing you here is not Revesz Muller. It is the same analysis, but using basketball as a key word in the ABC headline. And by the way, the blue lines are significance cutoffs for convenience. And what you can see here is, well, not a hell of a lot. The more the ABC talks about basketball, the nothing Donald Trump does. Well, maybe he goes to sleep a little, but you know, there's not much there. This is ABC News talking about basketball, doesn't have an effect on Donald Trump, and surely Donald Trump doesn't have an effect on the ABC News, okay? Because there's nothing below -2 or above +2. Along the y-axis, remember, that is the effect of tweets on coverage, whereas the x-axis is effect of coverage on the tweets. Okay, basketball. What about gardening? That's also pretty neutral, isn't it? New York Times gardening coverage does quite a bit, actually. It puts Donald Trump to sleep because he's far to the left there, nothing happens. He's tweeting less on a lot of word pairs. Out of the 1,500 he could have tweeted, there's a whole bunch he tweets less of, but it doesn't have an effect on the New York Times coverage. Revesz and Muller, New York Times. They talk about Revesz and Muller a lot. Donald Trump goes wild. And in response, there's a whole cluster of word pairs to which the New York Times is responding by reporting less about Revesz and Muller. There's this signature cluster of words that trigger or suppress media coverage on Revesz and Muller. Is this a coincidence? Well, if it is a coincidence, it's coincidentally also coincidental for the ABC, because you get precisely the same pattern there. ABC News talks about Revesz and Muller a lot. Donald Trump starts tweeting a hell of a lot of stuff. And some of those words apparently significantly depress the ABC News coverage the following day of Russia and Muller. So the distraction works. Moreover, the correlations of all these coefficients between the New York Times and the ABC range from between 0.24 to 0.63. So the New York Times and the ABC are synchronized to some extent. Are they always synchronized? No. The correlations between the two media outlets are near zero for the neutral items. When ABC News talks about basketball, that has no correlation with the New York Times. But when the ABC talks about Russia and Muller, that correlates with the New York Times. And moreover, the correlations are even greater for the suppression effect that Donald Trump has on media coverage the next day. So, what is going on? The data suggest that Donald Trump is strategically deploying a distractive device in response to coverage that he doesn't like. And the diversion works because the ABC and the New York Times, the two trend-setting, agenda-setting media organs in the United States, there's independent evidence that that is the case, and that's why we chose those particular outlets. They reduce inconvenient coverage. And they become synchronized. Donald Trump is taking these independent media organs, synchronizes them, and tells them don't talk about Russia and Muller, and they don't, effectively. And the public is also less likely to be interested in Russia and Muller as a function of these diversionary tweets. So, the president sets the agenda, 260 characters at a time. And that is contrary to the conventional wisdom of political science for the last 30 or 40 years, which vested the power of agenda setting largely with the media. And that is one of the things that's different now from the way things used to be. Does it have to be this way? The last couple of minutes, is this an inescapable thing that we're stuck with? No, there is a solution. Here's the solution. Move to Australia. A lot of reasons to do this. The reason I want to show you here is data from a study published last year, which was a study identical to the Trump-Sanders study that we did early, and I told you there was a small effect and I was going to get back to it. I'm getting back to it now, except in an Australian context. So I'm going to present you with two Australian politicians that also sometimes lie. They lie about different things. For example, 9 out of 10 Australians spend more than 90 minutes a day traveling to and from work. Well, that's false. It's not 9 out of 10. But anyway, that tells you something about Australian politicians and how, their lies are on a different scale. Here is a sample fact. Australian farmers are among the least subsidized in the world. That's true. And this is the result from the study looking at change in belief ratings. It's plotted slightly differently, but basically all you got to see is that for the dark bars, which are about myths, when we correct people, they adjust their belief downward. If it's facts and we affirm them, the light gray bars, people increase their beliefs. That's great. And it doesn't matter what the politics is. It doesn't matter whether you're left-wing and the myths and facts are congruent with those beliefs, or whether you're left-wing and they're incongruent, and vice versa. So political congruence between my desires for something to be true and the actual truth of a statement has very little effect. There's not much going on there. What about feelings? Now the light gray bars are for the condition where there's an equal number of myths and facts. Nothing happening, very much like in the US. And the dark bars are for the condition where we present 4 falsehoods for 1 true item. And what happens there is that you see a dramatic shift in support for the candidates. And that crosses partisan boundaries because, again, it matters very little whether this is congruent with your political opinions or not. If you encounter a politician in Australia who lies most of the time, you will reduce support for that politician, whether it's your own tribe or the other one. That is what these data mean. The effect size is 10 times greater, expressed in standardized units, than in the US in our Trump-Sanders study. So Australians are sensitive to politicians' accuracy. Are they somehow better people? No. I think what is happening is that really it boils down to the choice architecture. In Australia, voting is completely different from in the US. In Australia, voting is mandatory. You get fined if you don't. Compare that to the US, where you're lucky if if you're black and poor, good luck to you. Trying to vote is going to be really hard. In Australia, it's mandatory. And the voting system is preferential. You rank order the people on the ballot. So you can put the least evil first, and whatever. You can rank order the people, which means that all the parties are effectively competing for the same pool of people at every step of the way. So they cannot polarize as much as is happening in the US. And I think that is a very nice take-home message in this context where we talked a lot about choice architectures. Choice architectures matter even in politics. That makes a big difference. And there's evidence to support what I'm just saying. Okay, and you can read the conclusions by yourself. And thank you for your attention.